In the last talk, we were discussing architecture that speaks to your brain, that speaks to your intellect. And that is different from maybe architecture that we perceive more through our senses. This is thought-provoking architecture. And that doesn't mean necessarily that it's conscious. It could be unconscious provocation of thoughts. And we looked in particular in that talk at the way that the world can be presented in an orderly way, a systematic way, that's what the world is about, and buildings that reinforce a notion of the order of the world. Today in this talk, we're going to still be looking at that kind of intellectual expression, but now looking at a depiction of the world that might be more complex and ambiguous, or a depiction of the world that's about technology or technique, and seeing how those intellectual messages can be conveyed through form. So just like last time, we were looking at these two periods where intellectual pursuits were particularly lively in the world, where science and mathematics and intellectual thought were blossoming. And we were looking at the way in which architecture also in those periods had very strong intellectual content. So that was in the Renaissance, verging to the Baroque period, and in the modern, verging to the postmodern period. So today we're looking at these issues of complexity and technique and how they might have been played out in those different eras. We're going to begin with a very interesting building in Rome. It's called San Carlo alla Quattrofontana. It was designed by Francesco Borromini, and it is a Baroque building. It was just at the end of the Renaissance a kind of reaction to the earlier things that had happened in the Renaissance, a kind of expansion of Renaissance thinking. And if in the earlier part of the Renaissance order was so strong, there began to be a little questioning of the kind of maybe too authoritarian quality of order. Was the world really that orderly? Maybe in fact it's a little more crazy, a little more ambiguous, a little more complex than what was being depicted by architects like Palladio. So along comes Francesco Borromini, a very tormented man, a man who could overthink everything. And he was constantly seeing the ambiguity and the contradictions that were in intellectual thought. And he couldn't bring himself to do an architecture that was so dominated by order, but he wanted to do an architecture that was more real, more reactive to the complex and rich and diverse world that he found around him. And that was very much the case in San Carlo alla Quattrofontana. So in the urban context, this is in a very interesting position. So a couple of talks ago, we looked at Sixtus V making these long straight streets that go through Rome. This site was at the intersection of two of those long straight streets. One of those streets, as we're seeing in this slide right here, this street in that direction connected Santa Maria Maggiore, just down the way here, with the churches at Piazza del Popolo on the other end. And then the cross street went to Porta Pia, which is another building that Santa Maria Maggiore and Porta Pia are both talked about in Rasmussen's book, but this one went from Porta Pia down toward the Roman Fora. So these were two of those long straight streets. And where they intersected, there was a little mini piazza, a little piazzetta. And there was a fountain on each of the corners there. They were chamfered off. And there were four fountains that depicted the four seasons. And so this little piazza was called Quattrofontana, four fountains. So the site for this church was to be on one of those corners. Now, there were two ways that you normally made a church in Rome. If you had it on a piazza, a big open piazza. You might make an object building with a kind of tower or dome that centered the building right there. But if you did it on a street, you might make it more like a facade. There was a face of the building facing the street, and the other sides of the building were less consequential. So Borromini's thinking here, well, I'm kind of on a piazza. Quattrofontana is kind of a piazza. So he does make a kind of tower and a kind of object building that holds its own on this tiny little piazza. But also he's on this major street, and it is a more street-oriented site, so he makes a facade that very much orients to the street. And he does both. He doesn't make a choice. He expresses the complexity of this urban site. It is a little bit on a piazza, it's a little bit on a street, and the two of those are not maybe completely resolved. There's a little bit of war going on between those two attitudes toward what the building should be in a larger sense. But for Borromini, that was real. The site was complex. I should make the building express that kind of complexity. And it's exactly the same thing is happening in plan. So in the design of the interior of the church, there was likewise a kind of ambiguity for Borromini. In this period, there were kind of two ways that you designed the interior of a church. There was the more long-standing traditional way of thinking of entering a church at one end, having a procession down the aisle, and having the altar at the other end. That had been in Gothic churches, been in many Renaissance churches. That was a normal way to organize the plan of the sanctuary of a church. But also in the Renaissance, there had begun to be this idea of a centrally planned church. And that would be where there was a dome up above. There would be light that came in at the top of the dome. It was almost like God could occupy the center of the church. You put the altar in the middle. You put the audience around that. And God came in the center of the congregation. And that would have been a centrally planned church, which would be more like a circle in the middle of the church. And there was certainly an appeal to that. One talked about the ritual of the church, marching in the procession to the altar. The other one talked about the kind of relationship to God. And Borromini again was, why do I have to choose one? Really, both of these are appropriate. So in fact, he designs the church and in a very, very complex way, goes from being a kind of linear church at the bottom to then slowly morphing as it goes up from linear at the bottom to suddenly turning into a dome and kind of rounded at the top and allowing the light to come in and descend down into the congregation below. So he's made a processional church, as we see on the right, going down the aisle with the pews on either side. But the whole volume gets wider in the middle, and it has a dome on the top, and it becomes a kind of centrally planned church with God and the Holy Spirit occupying the church in the center. So again, it's that ambiguity, it's that complexity, it's the richness and diversity of thinking that has informed this very complex, very rich design for the church. Again, it's intellectual. We're meant to be thinking about all of these things, but now not in a clear, logical, choose A or choose B kind of way, but one that allows us to actually see the whole range of possibilities. Again, in the modern period, at the end of what we generally think of as modernism in the 1970s, 1980s, where there had been a lot of emphasis on order, as we saw in Bryn Mawr Dormitory last talk, you begin to get a little rebellion maybe against that. And architects and intellectuals thinking maybe of the complexity, the contradictions, the ambiguities that might inform intellectual thinking just as completely as order had done in an earlier period. This one is a museum, an addition to a museum in Denver by Daniel Libeskind, done in 2006. The original museum is here, and it's in the Civic Center in Denver. This is the main public library in the Civic Center right there. This is the Art Museum. There would be the City Hall. There's a whole bunch of public buildings around a green space in the center of downtown there. The site for the addition to the museum is off of that area. But in fact, what it really wants to be is be a part of that Civic Center. So the entire building gestures over to that Civic Center, almost as if it's reaching to become a part of the Civic Center on the other side. And the forms in the building are aggressively directional and trying to participate in this part of the city that they have a functional connection to, but that's a little bit disparate in the area. And then again on the inside, there's an ambiguity and a kind of crazy illogic in some ways that go on the inside. Libeskind understands completely that an art museum is not just a place to display art in the 21st century. An art museum is a place to see and be seen, and it's a community kind of space. A lot of people are going here that don't know much about art, maybe don't even care much about art, but the art museum becomes a kind of forum for interaction of people. So there are huge parts of the museum that really are not about displaying art and are really more about movement and about people gathering, and they're very dynamic, but they really are not meant to be places where you hang art. Now, there are works of art, obviously, in the galleries, and they often sit in a kind of maybe ambiguous way to the building around them. Many of the walls in the building are slanted, not a kind of wall you normally would put art on. There are times when it's a little tortuous to try to display the collection of this distinguished museum in an environment where there's slanted walls, and perhaps the paintings just need to have a vertical wall. I love this little Mondrian. Mondrian would have been that part of the 20th century that's all about order, rigor, orthogonal lines, right angles, only primary colors. And here he is in Libeskind's museum, where the museum is about, maybe the world isn't quite that simple. It's much more rich and ambiguous, and so the poor Mondrian can't quite sit up against the wall. It sits at an angle to the wall, and there's this precarious kind of dialogue between the painting and the building itself. So again, it's a thought-provoking building, but it's not answering all the questions. It's presenting maybe more questions than it's answering. And it's dynamic and ambiguous and complex, and it's meant to make you really kind of think about things. So complexity can be another kind of intellectual content in buildings. A third kind of intellectual content is this notion of expressing technique or the technology of building. And this was something, again, in the Renaissance they were very, very interested in. How can a building logically express how it's made? That seems important. That seems an appropriate thing to do. One of the great pioneers of the Renaissance was Alberti. And Alberti was, he and Brunelleschi kind of invented the Renaissance in Florence in the 15th century. This is a church that he did nearby in Mantua. And Alberti was a very thoughtful, intellectual man. We've talked before about Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture that were written in Roman times. Along came Alberti in the Renaissance, and he wrote 10 books on architecture as well. And in those 10 books, he talks about how you support a building, how you make a building, the technology of a building. And he said there are two ways you do this. One is you make walls, and if you then want to make an opening in them, you use an arch to carry those loads around that arched opening into that wall. The second way is you can use a trabeated system, or columns and beams, and then you line them up, and the openings are made by the holes between the columns and the beams. So both of those are logical ways to construct a building, as a wall a homogeneous thing with holes cut in it, in arches, or as columns and beams. And then in his work, he began to explore, how could I combine these things together and kind of logically make a building where you could feel all those gravity forces moving through the building and feel how its construction works. So in St. Andrea in Mantua, he's combined a trabeated system, the columns that we're seeing right here, and the beam going across it. And then he's combined that with a wall system a few inches behind it that is a wall that has big arched openings in it. He talked about in the 10 books that in a way an arch can be thought of as a bent beam. And here he expresses it almost like that beam that's going across there now is arched across like that. So he's trying to explain to you the tectonics of the building, how it's made, how it carries forces, the construction of it. And all the way through the building. I mean, you can walk into this building and just say, oh, wow, awesome, cool Renaissance church. But then if you look a little deeper, man, he is so articulate about how all of these forces are carried around those arches and those vaults, carried down into these architraves that catch those forces, and then they carry them down into the pilasters, which is sort of a column, but sort of a wall, a kind of hybrid column and wall. And you see that all thickening and like its muscles are tensing to carry those loads down at the corners of those great piers. So the architrave, the pilasters, the arches, the coffers in the vaults, all of these things are ways to articulate technique or what's required to make a building. And the same thing in the center, there's the great dome that then is carrying the loads to the ring, the drum around the dome, and then into the squinches, and then over the arches, and down to these massive piers that are articulated even more with the pilasters on the corner. Everything that's making the architecture is really an expression of technology, technique, gravity, loads, making a building. Now, that was in the Renaissance when we're building out of stone and with these massive, heavy loads. In the 20th century, something big happened. We got new materials like steel and reinforced concrete, where we could build massive buildings with very little material. We didn't need all the heaviness of stone or brick. And in this house by Gerrit Rietveld, the Schroeder House, very, very early in 1924, we have an architect exploring, whoa, what is this new technology? New kinds of materials, new ways of building. Look at these ocean liners they're making that are made out of sheets of steel, and they're massive, but they're lightweight. What about an airplane? Oh my God, it's defying gravity. It's made of these materials that are relatively lightweight and able to be carried up into the air. Why, when we make buildings, why should they be these ponderous, heavy things? We can make them out of new materials and have a completely different expression of that technology. So what we're seeing here are these tiny, slender steel supports. We're seeing these planes of reinforced concrete that are lightweight, and it's almost like building a house of cards here. It is a completely different idea about technology and about the way you build than might have been in a Renaissance church. And then in plan, that means you're able to make long spans. You don't have to have all these walls that support things in between. So we have this great open plan. You can have much more flexible way that you live inside this. You can have large expanses of glass, big connection to the outdoors. All of this because of new technology, new technique, new materials, new capabilities of building. And expressing that in a very explicit way, seeing that steel support, a steel beam, expressing its independence from that as almost like building with tinker toys. And then this slab of reinforced concrete that can cantilever out here because it's so strong. And these bits of steel that, kind of reach out really, really delicately into the air. And even in the furniture in the house, which he also designed, he's looking at plywood. Why do we need these heavy boards of wood? Now we can cross the grains and create plywood that's much stronger in a much smaller plane of bearing, and create this very lightweight, mobile kind of furniture. So he designs everything on the inside, the furniture, the cabinets, and it's a completely different feeling of what a building is than the traditional buildings at the time. In 1924, this was absolutely revolutionary, but it's talking about technique and about the future as made with new materials and new technologies. Maybe the ultimate building of the 20th century that is really an expression of technique is the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And this one really tells you what a 20th century, 21st century building is, which is very different from a traditional building. That church in Mantua, there was no air conditioning or heating or lighting or, basically no technology to speak of outside of structure. But now our buildings, we have huge demands, especially in an art museum. So he basically expresses this as what we need on one side are these big loft gallery spaces that need heroic long spans of structure to give us a lot of flexibility. And then we have all this area that is, we got to have air conditioning and heating and humidity control, and we've got to have transport and freight elevators and loading docks, and we've got to have fire stairs, we've got to have electrical wiring and plumbing, and that's really what a building is. And we conceal that. Why would we conceal it? We ought to express the fact that that's really what a building is in the 20th century. So the Centre Pompidou, which again, a very revolutionary building in a historic part of Paris, inserted in there. And again, it's a freaking art museum. What does it say about an art museum? It's just a big warehouse for putting art in. And so we're just expressing it as technology, these big flexible spaces for putting art in. And it's structural technology. We definitely see this, these trusses and all these connections. They originally conceived it, Piano and Rogers, as a building where the floors could actually be jacked up and down. So they would have flexibility, and you can make taller or shorter ceilings. That kind of fell by the wayside. But they still express that notion of these mammoth kind of intersections of structure that express those individual pieces and parts of the construction. And then inside the same way, we see those same mammoth trusses now with stainless steel on them that allow for that big flexible exhibit space for the paintings inside. But then it's not just about structural technology, it's also about transport technology. One of the major expressions of the whole building is the escalator, this machine that takes people, thousands and thousands of people, up and through the building. This is not the Louvre as a museum. This is a modern museum where bring thousands of people in there, and masses of them are moving through the building efficiently through this transport system. And that becomes a major expression of the building, is that incredible ride in the elevator and these vistas of Paris that you get from there. So that becomes an important part of the architecture. And then also all these mechanical systems, heating, cooling, humidity control, so that you're seeing intake valves as major architectural elements, and cold water movement and fans and all of that distributing air through the building. And it becomes, in a way, the architectural expression. It is the technique of making the building and cooling the building and heating the building and all of that you're made to think about, and that's what a building is about. And especially in an art museum where you have to be very precise about those things. And it's even down to plumbing and wiring and conduits, and all of that is expressed on the skin of the building. Again, emphasizing technique. So, in a way, we had a couple of talks ago, we ended with the Sydney Opera House. And we were talking about it as sensual form, just really speaking to our viscera, to our heart, to our soul, just a kind of emotional reaction to architectural form. And in this talk, we ended with the Centre Pompidou, which I think is a kind of classic building that is, although one might see a certain kind of beauty in it, it's really meant more to talk to your head. It's meant to talk to you about technology and about the 20th century and about the future and about what an art museum is. And it is an intellectual building. Now, both of those can coexist very beautifully in architecture, but they're two completely different ways of understanding and interpreting form. Okay, see you next time.